I must admit, of all the things I expected to come out of 2025, a survival horror game that feels like some hilarious South Park episode was not on my bingo card. You know, South Park The Stick of Truth was really onto something with Randy's alien abduction a few years back, but I must say, the Lacerator truly is a Randy Marsh the video game if there ever was one. Survival horror games have become pretty ironic lately. The horror genre, broadly speaking, allows people to simulate uncomfortable extremes in a controlled and safe environment. Our worries, our fears, the decay of our hopes and dreams, the feeling of having the things you treasure the most, and even the things you take for granted taken away. In psychological horror, the nightmares tend to reside in the protagonist's mind. In pure horror, they tend to be out of one's control. In survival horror, the playbook changes. Players get a gun here and some bullets there, but with more tools come more choices, and with more choices come more miscalculations and errors. And few things are more frightening in survival horror than your own errors. Missing a shot, jumping the gun too early on some medkit, so on and so forth. Mechanically and arguably, it's the most demanding horror subgenre to play. The early days of Resident Evil focused more on logistics, strategy. Resident Evil 4 would then explore what was once an uncharted territory of tactics. The scares went from long periods of looming dread to relentless immediacy, the here and now. Fast forward more than a decade later, and from Resident Evil 7 onwards, the genre has comfortably settled into a groove, one where both strategy and tactics play an equally important role. This new groove comes with the good, the bad, and the ironic. The good is that the more universal the template of survival horror gets, the more opportunities it has to get refined. The bad is that the universal nature of it all breeds familiarity, something that mixes with horror about as well as water does with oil, and that's ironic. For a game that shook up an entire genre in its heyday, a genre that really loves its clones, Resident Evil 4 is ironically lacking when it comes to clones of itself. Even the remake is barely close enough of a clone. It's a much beefier game that accomplishes some drastically different things. It'd be the easiest low-hanging fruit to point at any survival horror game with an over-the-shoulder camera and declare it as a Resi 4 clone at face value, but that's not the market gap that I'm referring to. What the original RE4 had that seems sorely missing in modern survival horror is an element of comedy that is purposefully used to highlight the horror, those self-aware fourth wall levels of absurdity. In a lot of ways, Resident Evil 4 is like Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead 2. Both the first Resident Evil and the first Evil Dead movie turned out to be unintentionally funny, and in both cases, the respective directors, Sam Raimi and Shinji Mikami, had the self-awareness to not only acknowledge the accidental comedy they stumbled upon, but to also capitalize on it in their following works. The Evil Dead 2 and Resident Evil 4 would go on to pluck that accidental comedy and deliberately plan it again within the overall framework to efficiently contrast and amplify the horror. It's easy to look at comedy and horror as incompatible extremes, but in practice they function more like magnifying lenses, zeroing in on different parts of the same reality being depicted. One of the many reasons I still regard the original RE4 as something so epitomical of the genre is that few horror games ever dare to layer themselves with such staggering juxtaposition. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what's so absurd about it. The fact that it's one of the most violent video games of all time, the fact that most of that violence is then punctuated throughout with intentionally funny cutscenes, or the fact that it feels so unnervingly bipolar as a result of having both. In all my years playing survival horror games, I've never seen anything come close to replicating Resident Evil 4's specific type of manic schism until now. Where Resident Evil 4 used comedy to amplify the horror, the Lacerator feels like the flip side of that coin, using horror to amplify the comedy. In The Lacerator, you play as Max, an adult film star who finds himself kidnapped, along with his co-stars, Stacy and Rodriguez. At first glance, the game gives the impression that it will be the typical homage to old-school survival horror or one of those puppet combo games, but The Lacerator shockingly rips and tears that notion to bits within the first few minutes. I mean that quite literally, as the game begins to dismember Max limb from limb through traps and contraptions lying in wait. If you set one off before disarming it, you're in for one hell of a surprise. In any other horror game, dismemberment would amount to a game over, but not in the Lacerator. I still recall the exact moment when I first finished the demo on Steam and noticed that I can get different endings and routes, and it hit me like a fucking piano just fell on me from the sky. I'm not just playing an homage to the original RE4, I'm also playing an homage to the original RE3. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis remains my favorite retro survival horror game, but it's also one of the best survival horror games, period. It is so good that many of its returning mechanics to Resident Evil 7 and onwards were highly instrumental to the recent renaissance of this genre. For all its clever returning mechanics, the life selection feature never made the cut. Similar to a QuickTime event, the life selection feature required you to make split-second decisions, but with a twist, as not every scenario boiled down to some binary outcome of press button to live, press nothing to die. The choices carried a lot more weight, directly affecting what portions of the game you will experience in your playthrough. This, alongside the usage of RNG and buttery smooth controls, made RE3 Nemesis a highly replayable game. If you've been longing for an alternative after all these years, you can't really go wrong with the Lacerator. While it doesn't necessarily rip off the life selection mechanic, I hope you pardon the pun, it channels an eerily similar feel of it through the laceration mechanic. Different traps and different pathways cause Max to lose different appendages. Max can lose anything from an arm to a tongue to even 2 of his 3 legs. Wait, what? 3 legs? That can't be right. Oh, you heard right. Max can even get gutted like a fish in this game and somehow still be left standing. This is how the game likes to use horror to amplify the comedy. Max is metaphorically, certainly not literally, a walking Monty Python bit.
Look, you stupid bastard, you've got no arms left.
Yes, I have.
Look!
It's just a flesh wound.
These lacerations, ridiculous as they are not even the half of it. When you first take control of Max, he's incredibly agile, a stark contrast to a lot of nonsensical protagonists in this genre who choose to run like a reincarnated sloth. Thankfully, Max has none of that bullshit going on, well, at least not voluntarily. The interesting thing about lacerations is that they fundamentally change how you play the rest of the game. Lose an arm and you'll no longer be able to unlock certain doors. Lose a leg and the game turns into a 3D version of Endoparasitic, spending the entire time crawling on the floor towards your survival. Once again, Max refuses to crawl at a snail's pace, so it's not as tedious as it sounds. The leg laceration unlocks an entirely different part of the game, allowing you to hide under furniture, crawl under pipes and through holes in walls, and you can still use your weapons to defend yourself. Other lacerations pertaining to Max's tongue, guts, or even his third leg initially don't seem to do much beyond crippling his ability to run, but they're actually the ticket to unlocking the best parts of this game. Throughout, you'll come across this stranger living in the walls. It's best not to overthink it, I'm just as confused as you are. So this wall weirdo, get this, he wants to eat every single bit of food that Max has no interest in eating. This includes lemons, bananas, chewed gum that's been disposed of, among other revolting things. But the idea is simply this. You give him the food he wants, and he gives you the things you want. Ammo, health, and backpacks to increase inventory slots. If you trade enough of these items, he'll eventually give you this. And this. And this. And this. Ooh, now that's my kind of survival horror. The vindictive type. Resident Evil 4, Bloodborne, The Evil Within, fucking Prey 2017. These are the ones that are just not afraid to start you off on the wrong foot, but then arming you to the teeth for the end, for that huge satisfying payoff that it was always building up to. Considering that Max can go from a tongueless monopedal to a saw-wielding martial artist singing bullets for teeth, the Lacerator obviously takes that philosophy quite literally. It is no surprise that I recommend the Lacerator, but only if you're willing to put up with one condition when playing it. The tank controls are going to dissuade some of you watching, I'm sure of that, but for those of you who enjoy the particular games I've just name-dropped, I think this is the type of hurdle that is worth getting over. If you've ever played the PC version of the original RE4 and downloaded the RE4 Tweaks mod that significantly improves the controls, then the Lacerator is going to feel right at home. The game isn't exactly drowning in accessibility options, but the most important stuff is absolutely here. Right off the bat, the game scores an absolute win in my book for providing the players the ability to choose between fixed cameras and an over-the-shoulder perspective. This is a 2-hour-long game that easily stretches up to 10 hours or longer, given that it expects you to do several playthroughs to get all of the endings. And might I add, these are some of the wildest, most bonker endings to a survival horror game I've ever seen. It is highly unlikely you will experience everything the Lacerator has to offer in just 1 or 2 playthroughs. I did go out of my way to get all of the endings, and coincidentally that has given me ample opportunity to test out both camera perspectives from start to finish. Personally, I find both perspectives to be very well constructed, even outdoing some of the classics in this genre. Some of the old-school survival horror games used to come with extremely unintuitive fixed camera angles that can leave you disoriented and not sure where to go. I'm happy to say that in my time playing the Lacerator with fixed cameras, I haven't really run into this problem. Part of its success also comes from the way the controls are set up. In both perspectives, the game allows you to aim with the mouse, which allows for sharp and precise turns. It is so responsive that I never found myself needing a quick turn button. Irrespective of the perspective you opt for, the game will always behave as if you're controlling Max from behind the back, not from a fixed camera angle. This means that the game controls exactly the same across both perspectives, and that includes the aiming. From over the shoulder, the Lacerator's aiming system is almost identical to Resident Evil 4's, but in fixed camera perspective, the aiming system behaves more similar to one of the discarded beta versions of RE4, famously known as the Hookman or RE3.5. At a glance, manual laser pointing in RE3.5 always looked impractical, but upon playing the Lacerator, I'm shocked at how little friction I came across when getting used to it. Whether you, the viewer, will experience it with the same level of ease, I cannot make that judgment for you. But what I will say is that if you're not accustomed to tank controls and fixed camera angles, I recommend switching to the over-the-shoulder camera. In my personal experience, both perspectives have their little quirks, blind spots, and unique advantages, but on the whole I found both perspectives to work remarkably well. I say remarkably because, given the strengths and weaknesses of both perspectives, one can imagine the daunting task at hand to not only offer 2 unique camera perspectives, but to implement them both successfully. Given how even Resident Evil hasn't done this yet, I can't imagine for the life of me that this was all sunshine and rainbows to pull off. That's not to say that blind spots don't exist. After all, it's probably not even possible to cater to both systems without at least a few caveats. But all in all, you could do way worse than a slightly less accurate aiming system in fixed cameras and heightened claustrophobia in over-the-shoulder. This game's developer, Games from the Abyss, really should be proud of the balance that's been achieved here. The game also comes with controller support. I did test a DualShock 4 controller on it and it works pretty well. This is the button layout I find works best for me, feel free to use it. It's a hybrid system that combines the controls of RE4 with those of The Last of Us. L1 has you run, square has you attack, the X or cross is for interacting with things, and triangles for the inventory. Since the aiming is done with the left stick, very similar to how RE4 controlled on the PlayStation 2, I then decide to map the aim button to the right trigger or R2, and that's basically it for the controls. As for the gameplay, I can't say I found the Lacerator to be much of a challenging game. I do not personally require a challenge from a game to enjoy it deeply, but I'm sure some of you watching feel differently about that. The Lacerator simply is not interested in challenging your reflexes as much as it is interested in challenging your observational skills. For genre veterans, ammo and medkits will be merciful and you won't have to be stingy. Let's say for example you found shotgun shells but you don't have the shotgun for it, but then you find a useful medkit. I would say 10 times out of 10 you should go for the medkit. Granted, the ammo you'll drop you won't get it back, but that's not going to be a problem, there's plenty more where that came from. That said, you do have to be careful about some of the puzzle items. It is possible you can pick up a puzzle item from one specific flow but end up choosing a different flow altogether and then not be able to discard it from your inventory. Conversely, I suspect that dropping items that can be discarded, like the screwdriver, can potentially softlock your game, which means you'll have to start over from the last checkpoint. Yes, I did say checkpoints, not save points. The Lacerator has predetermined autosaves at certain spots within the levels. Thanks to the game's laser-focused design scope, though, the pacing never feels like it's crawling at a snail's pace. Even if you account for the backtracking, the lacerational setbacks, and the occasional random enemy that blows you to smithereens. Despite that, I do wish the Lacerator allowed for manual saving of sorts. I mentioned something called flows a moment ago, so let me elaborate on that. The Lacerator offers 3 different story routes that each lead to a different set of endings, but the game refers to them as flows instead of routes. The most difficult thing about the whole game, I would say, is finding how to unlock all 3 of them. The game loves to defy modern gaming conventions in the sense that under no circumstance does the game ever spell out what each flow does or that you're even in one. This is absolutely wonderful in the first 2 or 3 runs, but it can get a bit tedious after that if you're trying to get all of the endings. If this is something you enjoy and would love to experience firsthand, please come back to this video later or skip to the following time code because I'm about to elaborate on that. The 3 different flows in the Lacerator are activated at these specific points within the opening prison level. Flow 1 activates if you take the path with the trapdoors and the spike pits. This path has you take an elevator up to the theater room and the bedrooms. If you go to the room with the screwdriver before you reach these trapdoors, you'll be locked out of the ending where you save Stacy, which is the hardest ending to obtain. To save Stacy, you'll have to avoid the room with the screwdriver at all costs. This means that, from all the methods I've tried to approach this, the only way to save Stacy is to sacrifice your arm, willingly. This is because you need to open this specific door that leads to the upper walkways that lead to the corridors with the trapdoors. If you grab the screwdriver first and, naturally, the hatchet next to Stacy's amputated arm on the prison bed, you will trigger the Lacerator to go after Stacy. If you trigger this, you will find her corpse in this room where the Lacerator spawns. However, if you amputate your arm to get to the revolver to shoot this chain door and proceed, you will still encounter the Lacerator, but Stacy will not be in this room. And that's about all there is to it. You will know she survived when she bursts out of this locker later in the game. Flow 2 can be activated no matter which prison cell you unlock at the beginning. You just have to get the screwdriver, climb up this vent, and end up in this room with the 3 electronically locked doors. Door 2 requires opening a gate using 2 gems, the red eye and the blue eye. Door 1 and 3 is how you obtain them. Doing so will unlock the door that leads to the indoor pool and the courtyard. Flow 3 is only accessible if you open Rodriguez's cell. You have to make your way to the kitchen in the basement and open this specific door. Behind it is a ladder that takes you to the sewers. Lovely. This flow goes completely different from the other 2. Throughout the game you fight inexplicably hostile enemies. I'm not even sure what they are, but I don't think that they're actual zombies. Given some of the endings, it's likely that these are all of the amputated Lacerator victims undergoing some severe psychedelic hallucinations. Flow 3 takes the small sewer section from the prior flows and expands it into a full-blown level. Completing said sewer level leads to a warehouse. What's interesting about this specific flow is that from the end of the sewer level and onwards, you get to fight actual normal humans that run, walk, and shoot at you. I could tell you all about how each flow differs in terms of endings because they do differ greatly, but doing so would be spoiling some of the best moments of this short and sweet video game. I don't even personally care for spoilers, but this is as far as I'll go. I enjoyed these endings so much that even I'm not willing to cross that line for this video. However, what I am willing to say tangentially is that the Lacerator's cutscenes and cinematography in general are, no joke, absolute cinema. No, seriously, some of the camera work and shot composition are truly magnificent to behold. In retrospect, it really puts into perspective why both the fixed cameras and the over-the-shoulder view are so well constructed in relation to the overall level design. But visuals only tell a fraction of a story, so how does the sound fare in comparison? The Lacerator's sound design is not gonna blow your socks off, but what it lacks in production value, it makes up for with just straight-up vibes and a commitment to its deadpan zaniness. The whole game's just coated with this analog lo-fi style of indie survival horror soundscape, reminiscent of PlayStation 1 times, but with an entire 80s synth and bass guitar vibe layered on top of that. The entire thing just sounds like the Seinfeld bass line if you downloaded the wrong Seinfeld off of the internet. Make of that what you will, but personally, I think it kicks more ass than Agent 47 at a yoga class. In conclusion, I had a great time playing the Lacerator. The more time goes by, the more we're seeing games and gamers measure content by their quantity, not their quality. In theory, it seems to sound plausible. We want X amount of hours for Y amount of money spent. It's a decent enough metric for brain-dead, checklist-style, open-world Ubisoft games that you hack away at while listening to some podcast in the background. But in practice, I just never found it useful for measuring actual game quality. I'll gladly take a 2-hour game that makes me want to play it 5 times over a 10-hour game that I will not touch, let alone remember again, any day of the week. The Lacerator is one such game that defies and kicks this metric to the curb, and it's all the better for it. I don't easily get scared by these types of games anymore, but I do recall a specific moment where the game made me almost jump from my computer chair, and it happened right here. This is why I'm comfortable comparing it to the original RE4, but not its remake. I like the remake enough to put 600 hours into that thing, but at no point did it ever manage to startle me or get me on the edge of my seat the way the Lacerator has. I think that says a lot. The Lacerator is not about the size of the dog in the fight, it's about the size of the fight in the dog. If that kind of survival horror resonates with you as much as it resonates with me, you've gotta check this game out. Much like how Max utterly refuses to die, the Lacerator refuses to obey genre conventions. In a sea of derivative, albeit occasionally heartfelt homages to the older eras in the survival horror genre, the Lacerator just comes out of nowhere swinging its Johnson with bold defiance and unforgettably chaotic fun. It really is the most unhinged survival horror game I've played in years. It's not the scariest survival horror game, but it might just be the funniest one. And with that, the Raven draws to a conclusion. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.